Welcome to episode 61 of the Selling Your Screenplay podcast. I'm Ashley Scott Myers, screenwriter and blogger over at sellingyourscreenplay.com. In this episode's main segment, I'm interviewing writer, director, and actor Stephen Mitchell. He's produced several low-budget films, and we talk through some of the key steps to making a micro-budget film, so stay tuned for that. If you find this episode valuable, please help me out by giving me a review in iTunes or leaving a comment on YouTube or retweeting the podcast on Twitter or liking it on Facebook. These social media shares really do help spread the word about the podcast, so they are very much appreciated. Over on YouTube, I want to thank Now Pow, Gingershine, and Stanford Crane for leaving me a nice comment on episode 59. As always, thank you guys for those comments. I always look at these comments if you have a question or comment about anything in the episode, please don't hesitate to leave a comment over on YouTube. YouTube has a really nice commenting system, so it's easy for me to respond to all the questions and comments. Thank you everyone who subscribed to the YouTube channel this past week. The SYS channel just pushed over the 600-person mark. So if you use YouTube a lot, please do consider subscribing to our channel. And on Twitter, thank you Rashid and Madam Adam, who retweeted various episodes on Twitter this past week. Thank you very much for those retweets. And on Facebook, thank you everyone who liked our page and shared last week's posts. There's a good amount of activity on Facebook page, so if you use Facebook, please do consider liking our page. I look at all the messages, questions, and comments that come in through Facebook, so it's a good way just to connect or ask a question. You can find our Facebook page at www.facebook.com/sellingyourscreenplay. A couple of quick notes. Any websites or links that I mention in the podcast can be found on my blog in the show notes. I also publish a transcript with every episode in case you'd rather read the show or look at something later on. You can find all the podcast show notes at www.sellingyourscreenplay.com/podcasts, and then just look for episode 61. Also, if you want my free guide, How to Sell a Screenplay in 5 Weeks, you can pick that up by going to sellingyourscreenplay.com/guide. It's completely free. You just put in your email address and I'll send you a new lesson once per week for 5 weeks, along with a bunch of bonus lessons. I teach the whole process of how to sell your screenplay in that guide, how to write a professional logline and query letter, how to find agents, managers, and producers who are looking for material. It really is everything you need to know to sell your screenplay. So just go to sellingyourscreenplay.com/guide if you'd like to check that out. So now let's get into the main segment. Today I'm talking with actor, director, and screenwriter Stephen Mitchell. Here is the interview. Welcome, Stephen, to the Selling Your Screenplay podcast. I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Thank you, Ashley. It's a pleasure to connect with you, and I was very happy to get your hello through stage 32.
Yeah. So to start out, I wonder if you can just give us a quick overview of your career, kind of how you got started in the entertainment industry.
Well, I got started, I suppose you could say, I lived on the set of Mission Impossible and a lot of other episodic TV shows back in the 60s. Medical Center, The Virginian, The Road West, Laredo, because a friend of the family became a mentor of mine, and he directed a lot of these episodes. But he did a substantial number of Mission Impossible. So I'd sit on the set and be talking to Michelle Hugo, who was the director of photography, and all of the actors. And I'd go into the edit room and see how the dailies were, what dailies looked like before they were cut into form. I'd see what the first answer print looked like before anything else happened. And I got a sense of the technology of making film or television. First, and I studied with Elliot Bliss and Peter Gibbons, who were the heads of the camera and sound department at CBS Cinema Center back in the day, and that gave us access to the sound stage and a lot of equipment that belonged to CBS. Then about 15 years went by because I knew how to make films, but no one told me how to get to make films. And I lived my life like I was in a movie instead of actually making movies. So I'd go to Italy and buy old Ferraris and Maseratis, and go to England and buy Bentleys and bring them back and sell them in Los Angeles, and had a stellar time. I mean, it was party time all the time, and driving these cars around was a lot of fun. But it finally occurred to me that I was being passed by and I really needed to make a move. I saw the French film A Man and a Woman by Claude Lelouch back in, I think it was 1965 or 6. And then in 75, I saw And Now My Love. The French title is Tout un vie. And I realized this too much time has gone by, and here's a film about making movies, and I'm not making movies. So I determined that I needed to go to France to start my career instead of where I was, where everybody in the world is coming to Hollywood, and I'm in Hollywood with a mentor in Hollywood and connections in Hollywood, and I pick up and go to France. So I end up in France, and I make my first film called Montmartre, and I shot it not only in France, but we shot it in French. I'd learned French very quickly, and I did this movie called Montmartre, which was like a Woody Allen take the money and run sort of faux documentary about this artist who painted on the square in Montmartre. And it was very amusing and a Woody Allen kind of humor, and that kicked off my career.
Huh. And so talk about that just a little bit, though. What made you make that decision? Like, why did you go to France? Why did you think that would be a better start for your career?
Well, it goes back to a man and a woman. Here's a film about a man who's a race car driver, and we see him racing at the Monte Carlo Rally and at Le Mans. Racing cars are a passion of mine. I at one time owned a Ferrari GTO that's worth $52 million today. Ralph Lauren owns that car today. And I would race it all over Southern California and go to racetracks like Willow Springs Raceway and drive with my friends on the track. The other part of the movie was about a woman who was a script supervisor on films, and there we saw footage of her making films. So the filmmaking, the auto racing, the ambience, the aesthetics, the locations of France just struck a chord with me that I found irresistible. And finally, when I decided I wanted to make the step, I felt that's what I wanted to do. There are lots of reasons and no one reason, but I had to satisfy that. So when I went to France, it was only to reconnoiter and spend 2 weeks to see what the situation was. I didn't know at the time I left that I'd end up living there for 2 years and make Montmartre, and then later The French Chef, which was a TV pilot I did with an actor named Philippe Léotard, who has won their César, which is their Academy Award for Best Actor. Quite a talented fellow. So it opened the door for me, and when I came back, when I was there, I had the cachet of being a Hollywood filmmaker, even though I hadn't made films yet in Hollywood. And when I came back, I had the cachet of being this expatriate who'd made films in France. There was sort of a cachet to that. So It worked both directions. It worked for me.
Mm-hmm. Did you have any contacts? I mean, I get a ton of emails from people that they're, outside of Hollywood and they're wondering if they should move to Hollywood and they don't know anybody in Hollywood. Did you know anybody in France when you went over there?
I had one phone number, and it was the sister of a friend of mine. She was not in the film business.
Okay.
And I barely spoke French. I'd had maybe a semester of high school French. So when I got there, I didn't even dare talk. But by the end of 2 months, I was fully conversant and having business meetings with no translator. I just picked it up very quickly.
Okay. And let's dig into this a little bit. So you're doing, you show up, I assume, in Paris. You don't know anything but this one friend of the friend type of a situation. What did you actually do? I mean, how did you even meet filmmakers? How did you get the money to produce this first movie?
Well, it was very interesting. Give me one person and you'll end up knowing the town if you know how to play your cards right. And here's what I did. First of all, I had my girlfriend over there call up one of the biggest movie stars in Paris. His name is Lino Ventura at the time. He's passed since then. But he was a star in several Claude Lelouch films. He was in Le Bonne Année, or The Happy New Year. He was in Money, 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 which was called L'Aventure, c'est l'Aventure in French. He was in a lot of films and of Lelouch films, but he's also a star of many films made by other filmmakers. So it was in that time and place, it was like calling Steve McQueen. So I had my girlfriend, who spoke French, she was French-Canadian, call him, and in French, of course, say that, Mr. Ventura, there's a filmmaker from Hollywood who would like to meet with you. Would you be open to that? And he said, absolutely. And he gave us his address, which turned out to be his home. So it would be like somebody from France coming over here and calling today, I guess it would be Brad Pitt, and saying, there's this filmmaker from France who'd like to meet you. And they said, come to the house. Yeah. Well, that's what happened. And in turn, I ended up meeting every film actor who'd worked with Lelouch in the films and movies that I had spent hours looking at and studying and wanting to make films like those. So André Dussolier and Charles Gérard and Françoise Fabian, who was in the Bonne Année. All these actors opened their doors to me. And I just said, it's Stephen Mitchell. I'm from Hollywood. Would you like to meet? Now, that was on the A-list side. As my circle of friends started expanding, I happened to land in a very good position where one of my friends was an actor who knew a lot of other actors. And so when the time came for me to make Montmartre, I just wrote parts for them because they had distinct personalities. And I wrote the part to fit their brand, their personality. The branding is very important to me, as it was to the old Hollywood studio system. All their actors were branded. So I would write for Jean-Jacques, I'd write a particular role, and for Hélène, I'd write another role. And there was one guy who wasn't even an actor, but he had a great personality. So I had him come out, and he played the head of the anarchist party who wanted to abolish just about everything in government. So he played a role. And it was very wonderful. You can't tell by watching the film which are the actors and which aren't. And somebody might say, well, that's because they're all uniformly bad. But in fact, they were all uniformly good. And it was a great pleasure to work with them. Mm-hmm. But what happened is in this group of friends, and it's a little different in Paris than it is in the States, but in Paris, friends tend to have you over for dinner all the time. So I had an apartment, so one night of the week they'd come to my place. Next night we'd be at Jean-Jacques, and the next night we'd be at Hélène's, and the next night we'd be somewhere else. And we'd sit, dinner starts at 8 o'clock in France, which kind of was news to me. So when I was first invited over to someone's house at 8 o'clock, I went and had dinner. And I showed up at 8 o'clock, and they're ready to have dinner, and I just finished eating in a restaurant. So I had to fake it and have dinner with them. Otherwise, it would have been rude. I learned very quickly that 8 o'clock was dinner. And we talk about movies and things. And one of the guys who was at these dinners was the ex-boyfriend of Françoise Sagan, the biggest novelist of the era. He was her boyfriend, and he was also a director of photography on film. And so it was kind of an interesting crowd. And through these, I met other people. And one guy said, I'll fund a movie if you want to make it. And I said, no, I'm not really interested. No. But we talked, we got our terms and conditions, and he was going to make the movie, and I'm letting it know I'm making the movie, and everybody said, great, and I'm writing parts for everybody. And then about 5 days before I'm about to start the movie, I get a call from him saying, I spent the money. I said, you what? You spent the money. What does that mean? Does that mean? And he said, yeah, it means, I can't make the movie with you. I thought, well, that's good news. And I think, now what? So I get that call at about, 3 in the afternoon. I go back to my apartment in Port Royal, and the phone's ringing. And I'm really not in the mood to be talking to anybody at this point. I'm kind of like, now what? I pick up the phone, and it's a guy I only know through friends of friends. And he says, I hear that you were going to be making a movie. And I said, yeah. He said, do you still need money for that?
Wow.
I thought, what? I said, yeah, as a matter of fact, I do. So he says, well, I'd like to fund it. I said, well, I'd like you to do that very much. So the next day I go to his office, and he reads the write-up that I did. And this is in French, of course, and he's reading it in French. And when it's over, he finishes it, and he says, c'est terrible, and shakes my hand and leaves the office. And his assistant's sitting there. C'est terrible means it's terrible. And then he shakes my hand, and I think, oh, man, bad news upon bad. So I'm thinking, well, that cooks that goose. And I'm sort of looking a little bit like, oh, well, what can I do? And his assistant says, what's the matter? He said, well, he just said it's terrible. He said, oh, no, in French, when you say it's terrible, it means it's great. If you say it's not terrible, that means it is terrible. So if the French say pas terrible, that means it's not good. But if they say c'est terrible, that means this kicks ass. So I was happy to hear that. And he put up the money and we made the film. And as a perk, he happened to be a cigar smoker, and at the time, so was I. And he used to have a humidor on his desk. And he said, as many as you want, whenever you want. Now, these were Romeo and Julieta Churchills, which cost about, I don't know, $30 a cigar. He smoked 10 of them a day. And now how the most I could do was one. How he managed 10 a day, I'll never know. But, you know, I'd take a few and, you know, 3 days would go by and they're gone. And I'd come back and take another one. And that was part of the payoff. So in addition to making the movie. So we made the movie and had a lot of fun. And that sort of established my credentials as a filmmaker.
Okay. Let me dig into two things that you did for that film, and I'd just be curious to hear your thoughts. When you had your girlfriend call this famous French actor, did you have some sort of like design on what you were trying to do, or you just figured, you know what, if I can meet this guy, maybe that will open the doors? Or I mean, did you think it through, or did it just work better than you thought? What was sort of your plan once you met him?
Well, I hardly ever think anything through. I know that aggravates a lot of people. No, in a way, I mean, my overriding agenda is I wanted to make connections, make films. And he was probably the most powerful connection you could have in France at the time. Beyond having him as a contact, I didn't really have an agenda for him. We got there, we talked for, I forget how long, maybe an hour or so. It was quite interesting. And when you look at Lino on screen, you see kind of a gruff man's man, no nonsense. He's kind of like that in life. And why he took that much time with me, I don't really know. We just liked each other. And I'd come in a taxi. He drove me home, which was very magnanimous of him to do. And just as a little side story, somehow the name Steve McQueen came up. I mentioned Steve to those newbies on the scene. I don't mean 12 Years a Slave. I mean The Great Escape, and that Steve McQueen. And he said a funny thing in French. He says, j'ai peur pour lui. I fear for him. Now, this was before he passed away. And it always occurred to me to wonder if Lino and Steve might have been friends and he knew that he was sick. I don't know. That only occurred to me later.
Yeah. So then the next thing, and I always try and get, when people sort of talk about, you know, a success or something that works out, I always try and get sort of a sense of the scope. Did you make up a list of like 12 powerful actors in France or powerful film people and have your girlfriend call all 12 and this one actually hit? Or did she make one phone call and it hit and you were off to the races? Very
good question. I had them all in my head because I'd been admiring their work on the screen. In Los Angeles, you know, there's the Laemmle chain of theaters that play art house type films with a predominantly French lineup, at least back in the day. And so I knew who these guys were intimately, and I wanted to meet the Lelouch players, the guys that habitually worked in Claude Lelouch's films for whatever reason at the time. That's what I wanted. So Lino was the very first one we called, and he said, fine. And the next one was André Dussolier, who was the co-star of Tout en Vie. He's been in a lot of films since then. He said, fine. In fact, I went to his apartment one day, and then later when my agent came to town from Hollywood, we all went to dinner together. And so it's a little more social, or at least I treated it on the social level. And this is sort of a tip I would give to people, but maybe I won't bring that up just yet. We can come back to that. Next was Françoise Fabian. So one by one, I was meeting them and making a good impression because we stayed in touch.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So let's go ahead and we'll dig into your book, How to Shoot a Feature Film in 15 Days and to Survive to See Profits. And we'll talk a bit about the film Dead Right that you kind of chronicle in that book. Yeah. to me, the pivotal moment, I mean, the pivotal moment, like everyone always talks about, how hard filmmaking is and this, it's like 99.99% of the hardness of filmmaking is getting the money. Like everything else is a pretty, is all downhill once you get the money. So to me, the pivotal moment, and you go over it pretty quickly in the book, but to me, the pivotal moment is when you're in Las Vegas and you meet this distributor or producer, and he agrees to finance this film. So let's talk about that a little bit. Number one, I'd just be curious to hear sort of your approach to going to film festivals and film markets. Do you go to a lot of them? Do you try and network and just basically repeat what you did in this particular case over and over again?
The only festival that I go to repeatedly, or most often, let's say, is Cannes. Because I feel like France is my home away from home, or my second home. I enjoy the atmosphere. I enjoy the atmosphere of France, but I also love the atmosphere of the Cannes Film Festival. There's something special about it. And so I do go there. And more often than not, I go to, as you say, meet and network. And I'll go and just collect business cards. I won't even try to do anything at the festival because I know these guys are there to sell product. They don't want to talk to somebody who's trying to sell product to them. So I'll go in, I'll say, who's your director of acquisitions? Do you have a card? Yes, thank you. And off I go. I don't waste their time. For a real good example of that is I was a co-producer on a film called, a documentary actually, called Addiction Incorporated, that was directed by Charlie Evans Jr. He also produced The Aviator with Leo DiCaprio. And I wanted to get some money for the film. And I knew if I'm going through the Palais and going to each booth saying, I need money they'd give me the bum's rush immediately. So what I did is I'd say, who's your director of acquisitions? And I collected cards all day long. That night, I went back to my hotel and I sent emails to each one saying, here's our documentary. At that time, we had Brett Morgan, who directed The Kid Stays in the Picture, that documentary, as the director. Ultimately, Charlie directed it. And I said, here's what we've got, and we're looking for co-production funds. That same day, before the day was over, Studio Canal calls my cell phone and says, can you meet us tomorrow? I said, well, yeah, actually I can. So I met them in Paris at their studio locations. Now, at this moment in time, Studio Canal just announced they were doing no more co-productions. This is why you don't listen to what's circulating in the cosmos. I had a product they wanted. Now, here's how badly they wanted it. The price for this documentary, the budget at that time, was $2.3 million. And if anybody has any experience with documentaries, most documentaries, for that amount, you could make 10 documentaries. But we had a superstar in the documentary world, Brett Morgan, a very good subject. And they, based on one phone call and a description and a brief meeting, were willing to put up $1.7 million on a documentary after they'd announced they weren't doing co-productions anymore. So the point of that is never pay attention to the rules. Never follow lists of procedures given to you by people in the industry, because that generally takes you out into the parking lot and puts you in the parking lot where you're not going to bother anybody when you want to be in the stadium on the 50-yard line. That's where you want to be. You want to be taking the snap. Mm-hmm. And you don't get it onto the stadium at the 50-yard line taking the snap by taking all these pre-formulated rules on how to do it, because that's designed to get you out of their hair, because there are too damn many people wanting to be actors, wanting to be producers, wanting to be writers. So they come up with all this really good stuff to get you out of their hair. Their statistics aren't your statistics. Your statistic is to get in the game, not to follow their rules.
So just to clarify, did this meeting with Studio Canal, did that come as a direct result of one of these emails you sent? You got the business card, sent the emails. This came directly from that.
Absolutely. The procedure, the protocol was, I got the business card from a booth Studio Canal's booth at the festival, sent them an email that afternoon, got their return call that afternoon, met in their office the next day. The next day after that, they gave me the figure of 1.7.
Okay. So let me just run through this
that quickly.
Let me run through this process just so people can potentially try this themselves. So you go to the film market. There's Studio Canal has a booth. They're trying to basically sell their product to the the foreign people that buy the product. So you walk in. The first person you see, you say, "Hey, do you have a director of acquisitions?" What do you actually ask for when you first walk in?
That's what I said. Bonjour. Help that I spoke French a little, but you don't have to because I speak English. Mm-hmm. And I said, hello, do you have, who's your director of acquisitions? And they'd say so-and-so. And do you have his card or phone number? Yes, they had the card. Thank you very much.
Okay. So you wouldn't even meet the director of acquisitions. You would just get their business card from some other person working in the booth, and then you're basically good to go. Now, I'm curious, why couldn't you maybe try and get that from IMDb Pro or something like that?
Well, I guess you could, but I liked being hands-on. I liked being at the festival. I liked having his business card and his personal email and knowing this is the guy. Mm-hmm. Because, IMDb Pro, I don't know how often they update it. It could be out of date. I'm not saying don't use it. I'm just saying what I've done. And I don't know necessarily that what I did was the best way, but at least it worked for me.
Yeah. So I'm curious too. I talked to another guy who did something similar to AFM in another episode, and one of the things he did was he asked if they did co-productions, and it doesn't sound like you took that step. You just got the director of acquisitions. Are there? Because it seems like there's going to be some distributors that really have no interest in ever doing any kind of funding.
Well, bear in mind that Studio Canal had just announced publicly that they weren't doing any more co-productions. Mm-hmm. Had I listened to that headline in the trades, I wouldn't have even gone to their booth.
Yeah. Okay,
so
good to know.
A lot of times that kind of news, that kind of information is used. If you've ever played football, you know what a straight arm is when you push the guy who's trying to tackle you away? That's a straight arm. If they want something, they'll get involved. Don't listen to that. Don't listen to anything. Okay. Because you may be the only guy that they do a co-production with that year. Mm-hmm. Make them actually say no to you.
Okay. Now, I again, just a one bit of clarification. Like when you said director of acquisition, I'm thinking that's generally the person who is, reviewing DVDs of completed movies and deciding if they want to distribute them. You're saying that the director of acquisition actually will be the one who brings on raw screenplays and will.
Well, that's what I asked for. I'm not pretending to know the exact hierarchy or what the job assignments are. Mm-hmm. But I made the call. See, here's what happened. I asked for the acquisitions. I sent the email to him. Now, when I walked into that meeting, there were two people in that meeting, maybe the director of acquisitions and maybe someone else who was in charge of co-production. But if they're interested in something, they'll get the right guy in front of you. You don't need to know who they all are. They know who they are.
Okay. Now let's talk about this email for a minute. Maybe you could just quickly kind of review what exactly you wrote in this email that you sent off that night. It sounds like you had some decent credentials involved with this documentary, so maybe mention those. But just tell us sort of the specifics of that email, because I think that will be helpful for people that are going to send these types of emails out.
Yeah, I had created basically a one-page that talked about Addiction Incorporated. And Charlie Evans looked it over and approved it, and we went through it. And I attached that to the email. And basically I said, I'm at Cannes. I have this project, Addiction Incorporated. The write-up's attached. And I'm looking for co-production, interest in co-production to get this film made. And it was just a one page. But the idea, the idea was a good hook. It was about a guy who worked for Philip Morris, I say William Morris, who worked for Philip Morris and created a safe cigarette. Now, it didn't save you from cancer. Everything gives you cancer. You stand too close to a microphone for 5 years, you get cancer. But as far as cardio, heart conditions and emphysema and things like that, it solved that problem, which was a big deal for the cigarette companies. Then, the minute Philip Morris realized that he'd created the safe cigarette, they fired him because the last thing they want to do is announce a safe cigarette because they've been saying their cigarettes have been safe all along. So they had to stay on that message. Make it a very interesting hook, a very interesting documentary. Yeah. So having a good subject matter helped a lot. Having Charlie Evans Jr., at that time he was the producer, helped, and having Brett Morgan, who was a superstar in the documentary world, was also helpful. But then if we get to Las Vegas, I had none of those things going for me in terms of getting Dead Right made.
Okay. So let's go ahead and dig into the book. One of the things, and I think maybe you can just kind of speak in sort of even just general terms, sort of about making a movie. So let's just say you've got, we have a screenwriter, he writes a script, he goes out, maybe he just raises the money himself. And then the next step is to go out and actually produce the movie. One of the things that was really interesting about your book was just, how to get a lot of production value into your movie without having to spend a lot of money. So maybe you can kind of, walk us through that process a little bit. How can people shoot in great locations without spending a lot of money?
All right. Well, as you know from reading the book, I love to shoot in the desert because it's a wonderful landscape. It suggests a lot of things psychologically to people. The barren waste and the heat and going all the way back to Lawrence of Arabia. The desert just speaks to me visually. But when I'd go, I'd shoot in the desert because we don't have to worry about innocent bystanders. We can do car chases. We can do all kinds of stuff in the desert. But you can't stay in the desert. So I always tried to make sure that I got to Las Vegas at some point in the film because I like to have Las Vegas on the poster. Because what I found from talking to buyers at the various festivals, when they could see a Las Vegas scene on the poster, they kind of like that, or a description. They like Vegas because Las Vegas is a destination resort for around the world. It has its own magic. So I thought, let's let Las Vegas help sell the film. So we'd go to Vegas. And for example, one day I wanted to shoot in the Mint Casino. Now I'd always heard you can't shoot in the casinos. It's verboten, don't even ask. So following my rules, you don't ask. So what I did is we had our trucks around the corner. I walk in with my assistant, asked to see the manager. And next thing you know, some New York hood with a broken nose comes out. He's the manager. And for the night anyway. And he says, yeah, what can I do for you? And I said, well, what I'd like to do is shoot some scenes for my movie in your casino here. He says, when? I said, right now. He says, get the sign. Well, what he meant was make sure you get a shot of the sign and put it in the movie so it's advertising for it.
Uh-huh.
So I said, no problem. He says, these guys, okay. To some pit boss or so, I don't know who. And that was that. So I go out in the parking lot and bring all my guys in. And the next thing you know, I'm walking through with an Aeroflex on my shoulder, shooting my actors, walking through the casino and doing all sorts of stuff, coming in and out of the doors, stuff you're not supposed to be able to do.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things, again, I just like to get a scope of these things. And you must have some failures where you walk into a place and say, hey, can we shoot here? And they say, get the hell out of here. And I like to just get some, scope, because rejection is definitely part of entertainment industry. And so, walking into places and getting rejected, I don't want people to feel like if they go into a casino and they get kicked out, that means that they've failed. It means just, pick up and maybe try another one. But maybe you can talk a little bit about some of the times that things didn't work out, just so people understand that those times do happen.
Okay, as improbable as this sounds, the only failures I had was when I asked in advance. And then when I came back, they'd changed their minds. Now think about that. Why they said yes when I was there, or if I went to Caesar's Palace today and walked in, the answer may be different because times have changed perhaps. but they might not be different. I don't know. But at least at that time, I never got a no when I asked and was ready to film on the spot. I never heard a no. I wanted to film in a liquor store one day, and they said, yeah. I came back the next night. Oh, no, we can't do it. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm in Ensenada, Mexico, and one of the big cruise ships is parked in the harbor, docked. There people are on enjoying the town. And I go up the gangplank and ask if I can bring my crew on and shoot scenes from my movie on board the ocean liner. And they said, come right aboard. Now, try getting permission to do that. You couldn't, but I did. And I found that very often if you go to a restaurant and you say, we're shooting a movie, I'd like to shoot a scene at the table over here, and I'm going to buy everybody lunch while we're at it. I never had any restaurant turn me down. And in fact, there's a nice restaurant, you may know it, downtown Los Angeles called the Pacific Dining Car Restaurant. It's a great place to go get steaks and drink scotch and hang out with wealthy attorneys and politicians. It's that kind of place. I walked in with my camera, 2 actors, ordered lunch, and I sat on one end of the booth and did a 2-shot going past the face of one actor and being focused on the second actor. And then I got up and turned around. We did the scene again, shooting the other way, got the whole scene, had a great lunch, and left.
And never even mentioned to anybody that worked there that you were shooting a movie.
Nobody cared. Now I was prepared to use available light, and the lighting was good. And, I had everything set for the type of shooting conditions I'd be in. On another time, there's another great old restaurant called Philippe's downtown. French dip sandwiches. I think it may be the oldest restaurant now. I walked in there. I wanted to use more of the restaurant than just one table. So I asked the owner, happened to be in the restaurant. He says, yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
So now I'm getting all these wonderful locations for no fees. They're just freebies. And then another thing, too, I knew about product placement. When I shot The French Chef in Paris, I wanted a new Renault automobile for Philippe to drive around in. Renault gave it to us. I wanted him to be wearing a gold Rolex. So I talked to Rolex on the Avenue Grande Armée. They said, no problem. What size is his wrist? So they could take the link out so it would fit correctly. They did. So in The French Chef, there's Philippe driving, I think it was a Renault 18, and he's wearing this beautiful yellow gold Rolex. The guy from Rolex came into the post-production house, and he sees Philippe with a Rolex, and then he sees the girl that's playing with Philippe. You should have asked for one for her.
Huh. So one of the things that occurs to me, and it occurred to me now, I would say even more, it seems more apparent talking to you, but when I was reading your book is, you have a real gift of chatting people up and talking with people. And I think that you might take that for granted. And I wonder if you can give us some tips, because everyone doesn't have this sort of, they just don't have the gift of gab. They can't just chat people up that they don't know. And I wonder if you have some tips, whether maybe it's conscious, something you've actually really cultivated in your personality. Maybe there's some tips for how to go about, talking some of these actors into being in your movies with no budget, talking to some of these people. Because it seems like that's kind of a lot of the secret to the success that you've had.
I cannot stress enough how important that is. Because with an inability to connect to people in that fashion, you then have to abide by all the rules. Your screenplay has to have margins this big. It has to have a certain format and a certain number of pages, and it has to be submitted through an agent. And you have to follow all those rules that will kill any project dead. The likelihood of you going through all of those protocols and requirements dictated to you by the industry and countless workshops to get exactly the right screenplay and then selling it it's tantamount to winning the lottery. Somebody's going to win the lottery, but you don't count on it for something that's really important. You don't count on it to pay the rent. You don't count on it to make the movie that's inside you that has to come out. You don't follow those rules and get that movie made. You get movies made because the film business is like the rest of planet Earth. You have to be able to connect with people and make friends and let them know that even though they haven't seen what you can do yet, they have confidence in you because the way you presented yourself, and I don't mean putting on a suit and tie and going looking that way. I mean by knowing what they know and living up to their expectation of someone who knows what they're doing. Someone once gave me, another mentor of mine gave me an interesting definition of a wise man. He said a wise man is somebody who knows what you know. Now think about that. Let's say you've been distributing movies for 20 years. You know things about movies that filmmakers don't even know. From 20 years of distributing their work, you know at a glance what's going on. And when a guy walks through the door and says a couple of things that makes him think, this guy knows what I know. I don't have to explain all the jokes to him. I don't have an expectation that he's going to go out and do something ridiculous. You've just gained cred with that guy because you've shown him you know what you know, or what he knows rather. That's so important. If you don't have the gift of gab, and apparently I do, I suggest you join Toastmasters, and learn to give speeches in front of public until it's comfortable, until it's easy. The other thing is, in my repertory company, I had 100 actors at any given time. And, I said, sooner or later, maybe this week, maybe next month, you're going to get in front of a director who can hire you into a film. You've got to have things to speak to him about other than your desire to be an actor. If all you can speak about is when do I know if I got the part, you're not going to get the part. But if you've seen Humphrey Bogart's Beat the Devil and you can talk about that ensemble parody of a film noir, he knows you've got some history. When you walk in and I say Steve McQueen and you don't know who he is except that some guy named Steve McQueen made 12 Years as a Slave, or 12 Years a Slave, you're not going to connect with me. Mm-hmm. Because you haven't been paying attention to what's been going on in the business. Dennis Hopper said an interesting thing once. He said it's not enough just to know what the history of your industry is. You should know what the great artists have done and the great artists of your time are doing. Because, for example, I saw a film last week called Mr. Turner. Wonderful film. It's like watching a painting for 2 hours. Not a dry moment in the whole piece. And to look at that film and to make that film, he had to have known a lot about art of its time and of its period and what made this interesting. And not just, I'm going to tell this guy's story, but he got the nuances of the story. I mean, it's a beautiful film, worth seeing. But the more you know, you can. Billy Wilder said an interesting thing. I didn't make my millions making movies. I made my millions collecting art. Now, what does that mean? You go in, you're talking to a director, and somehow you're able to talk about painting. And he goes, I collect art. Well, most of them do. Now you know what they know. If all you know is that my margins are this wide and I've got a log line, that's good, that's important, but that's very low on the list. You're not connecting with them. He knows what a log line is. That's basic. Mm-hmm. But if you know what the world is, if you can inhabit his world a little bit. I used to have all my actors read Vanity Fair magazine. Now, why did I do that? Vanity Fair, at first glance, sounds like a woman's magazine, like jewelry, and it's not. They have articles about the top of the pyramid and all the different endeavors known to mankind, whether it's banking and finance or movies or fashion. And that top level of the pyramid of each of these industries circulate amongst each other. They all know each other. For you to be what the French call au courant, that means up to date with what's going on in those worlds, will bear fruit when you get into a conversation or he takes you to lunch. You're a complete person now, instead of somebody who's only advertising their desperation to get into the film business. They don't buy that. That doesn't sell. So
no, excellent tips. So how can people find your book? Again, it's called How to Shoot a Feature Film in 15 Days and to Survive to See Profits. Where can people find that and potentially buy it if they want to learn more?
The easiest place is Amazon.com.
Okay.
And you can buy it in paperback if you like holding books, or you can buy the ebook if you are more digital in nature. It's there.
Okay, perfect. And I will link to that. Perfect. I'll link to that in the show notes so people can just click on over to it. I always like to wrap up the interviews. What's the best way for people to keep up with what you're doing and just follow along? Do you have a Twitter handle, maybe a Facebook page, a blog, anything you really want to mention? I can link to in the show notes. I found your blog, this emcpb.blogspot.com. Should I link to that in the show notes?
Please do. That keeps them up to date. The the novels I've written are listed there. And I have two aspects to my interests. One are Ferraris. So if you happen to like Ferraris, you're going to see the Ferraris I've owned and driven and news about the Ferrari world. If you like feature films, you're going to see a lot, especially about my history growing up in the Hollywood arena and meeting some very interesting people and having Marlon Brando calling because he liked a show of mine that was on TV. You know, all of this is there. And then, of course, if someone is interested in really connecting and finding out a lot more, cineparis@hotmail.com. Anyone can send me an email, and if they have a question, I'm more than happy to respond. This is a career, but it's also a passion for me. It's not just a job. One of the people that you had, and I wish I could remember his name, mentioned that at some point he decided that he wasn't interested in writing for hire, that he wanted to write what he wanted to make. And that resonated with me because when I made my interview show, that was to sell stories to A-list Hollywood, and it worked beautifully. But when I make a film, when I pick up the camera, I want to cast it, I want to direct it, I want to write it, I want to live the experience of making it, I edit it. And to do it any other way would be like contracting someone to chew my food for me. Mm-hmm. Pardon that analogy, but it just makes no sense. Why would you do that? Mm-hmm. Anyway, that's just me being me.
Perfect. So, well, you've been very generous with your time. I really appreciate you coming on the show.
It's been a pleasure.
So last week we launched the new SYS Script Consultant service. It's a really economical way to get high-quality professional script evaluations on your screenplays. All the readers have experience reading for studios, production companies, or contests. The readers I've partnered with are the gatekeepers of the industry. They're exactly the same people who are going to be reading your scripts at the companies that you submit to. The readers will evaluate your script on several key points like concept, structure, character, dialogue, and marketability. Every script will get a grade of pass, consider, or recommend. You can read a quick bio on each reader and pick the one that you'd like to read your script. We're still going to be offering the in-depth screenplay analysis by industry veterans service. While I think this is a great service and offers tremendous value for what you're getting, it is a bit pricey, so I wanted to create a service for people who maybe didn't want to invest quite as much money into the notes. So if you want a professional evaluation of your screenplay at a very reasonable price, check out our new service, which can be found at www.sellingyourscreenplay.com/consultants. In the next episode of the Selling Your Screenplay podcast, I'm going to be interviewing screenwriter, actor, and director Adam Green. Adam is a writer, director, actor in the horror genre. He's written and directed such films as Hatchet and Hatchet 2. He's got a new film out called Digging Up the Marrow, and we talk about how that film came to be, and we really dig into his early career and kind of how he got started. It's a great interview, offers a lot of really good insight into just how to kind of get your career started from nothing. I mean, he's a classic example of somebody who has succeeded. He didn't know anybody in the industry. He just got out of college and just started making films, working in production, making films, and eventually kind of got some heat on some of his projects. So keep an eye out for that episode next week. So there were a lot of great takeaways from this episode today. Hopefully this sort of episode will help to inspire people to just go out and make movies. If you're thinking about possibly shooting your own film, you should definitely check it out. Check out Steven's book. We mentioned it a little bit in the podcast, but his book goes into some great detail. We really only scratched the surface of what his book covers. I will link to the book in the show notes, Steven's book. Again, if you're thinking of making a feature film on your own, it's just a great great sort of book to read. I mean, I don't know if there's a lot of like super practical, nuts and bolts tips, forms, legal forms or legal advice, but he goes through this process of making his films, and there's just a lot of, understanding what problems he's going to face and how he overcame those problems. And again, we talked about some of this in the interview, but it's just, it'll give you kind of a good sense of what to expect when making a feature film. There's a lot of problems, and no matter how much preparation you have when making an independent film, there's just problems creep up, and you're going to need to, get past those problems and overcome those problems. And his book will kind of give you some real insight into, what sort of problems to expect and potentially how to overcome those problems. I think the biggest sort of single takeaway for me today was his advice to have outside interests other than just film. I think this is so important. I mean, the entertainment business really is all about relationships, and connecting with people on a personal level really can't be underestimated. And if everything that you talk about and everything is all about film and movies, you're going to be a kind of a very one-dimensional, boring person. And expanding your interests, whether that be family, kids, and just things outside of cars. I mean, Stephen has a great love for cars. Just having these outside interests, that those sorts of interests and connections are what is really going to connect with other people, and those deeper relationships. It's not about having, in the entertainment industry, it's not about having 100 superficial relationships. It's really about having, maybe 3 or 4 or 5 relationships that are really deep and good, trusting, reciprocal relationships with people. Just 3 or 4 key relationships would be much more valuable than 100 very superficial. And one of the ways to get those deeper relationships is to connect with people on something more than just, a script or a film. Anyway, that's the show. Thank you for listening. Hope you got something out of it.